September 13th, 1935, Dessau, Germany. A test pilot named Willi Neuenhofen sat in the cockpit of a prototype aircraft that would change warfare forever. The Junkers Ju-87, designation V1. The first real Stuka. His orders were simple. Dive the aircraft at 80 degrees, almost vertical. Hold it steady. Release a practice bomb. Pull out before hitting the ground. Simple. Except nobody had ever done it before. Not in an aircraft this heavy. Not at this angle. Test pilots who'd tried similar maneuvers in other prototypes had either pulled out too early, missing their targets by hundreds of yards, or pulled out too late and augured straight into the earth. Neuenhofen advanced the throttle. The Junkers climbed to 13,000 feet. At altitude, he rolled inverted, pointed the nose straight down, and deployed the dive brakes. What happened next would become the foundation for the most accurate bombing system of World War II. But it would take one pilot's obsession with an impossible technique to prove that a Stuka bomber could hit a target the size of a kitchen table from 2 miles up. This is the story of how German pilots perfected a method so precise, so terrifying, that it could place a 1,000-pound bomb within 30 feet of any target, and how that precision would make the Stuka the most feared aircraft of the early war. But to understand the revolution, you have to understand the problem. In 1931, a German WWII fighter ace named Ernst Udet was visiting Cleveland, Ohio. He wasn't there for the weather. He was there for the national air races, and what he saw changed his life. US Navy pilots were demonstrating dive-bombing techniques with Curtiss F-11C Goshawk biplanes. Udet watched as American pilots rolled their aircraft into near-vertical dives, screaming toward targets on the ground, releasing bombs at the last possible second, then pulling up so hard the aircraft shuddered under 6 or 7 G-forces. The accuracy was stunning. These pilots were hitting circles 20 yards wide from 10,000 feet. That level of precision was impossible with conventional level bombing. Horizontal bombers flying at altitude had hit rates around 3%. 97 bombs out of every 100 missed their targets completely. Udet understood immediately what this meant. A dive bomber could do what artillery couldn't. It could appear without warning, strike a specific building, a specific bridge, a specific tank, and disappear before defenders could react. It was flying artillery, mobile, precise, devastating. He approached the Curtiss representatives after the demonstration. "I want to buy one," he said. They quoted him $14,000. Udet didn't have $14,000. He was a stunt pilot. But he knew someone who did. Hermann Goering. Udet called Germany. "I've found something you need to see," he told Goering. "But I need money. A lot of money." Goering, who was building Hitler's new Luftwaffe in secret, asked one question. "Will it win battles?" "It will win wars," Udet replied. By September of 1933, Udet had purchased 2 Curtiss Hawks with German government funds. He shipped them to Germany and immediately began demonstration flights for Luftwaffe commanders. The demonstrations were spectacular. Udet would climb to altitude, roll inverted, pull the stick back, and drop into a screaming vertical dive that made observers' stomachs clench. At 3,000 feet, he'd release a practice bomb. At 1,500 feet, he'd haul back on the stick with both hands. The Curtiss would groan, the wings would flex, and the aircraft would level out at treetop height with the practice bomb detonating directly on target. Observers were convinced. But there was a problem. The Curtiss Hawk was an American aircraft, a biplane, already becoming obsolete. Germany needed its own dive bomber, something purpose-built, something that could carry heavier bombs, absorb more punishment, and dive even steeper. The Reichsluftfahrtministerium, the German aviation ministry, issued specifications. Multiple companies submitted designs: Arado, Heinkel, and Junkers. Junkers' chief designer, Hermann Pohlmann, took a radical approach. Most aircraft designers were obsessed with speed and maneuverability. Pullman was obsessed with one thing: structural strength. A dive bomber had to survive forces that would tear apart conventional aircraft. It had to pull out of near-vertical dives while carrying heavy bomb loads. It had to be simple enough that average pilots could fly it, rugged enough to operate from improvised airfields, and accurate enough to hit targets smaller than a tennis court. Pullman's design was deliberately ugly: inverted gull wings that gave the fixed landing gear clearance, a massive, angular airframe that looked more like a flying tractor than a sleek fighter. Critics called it crude. Pullman called it robust. But the key, innovation, wasn't the airframe. It was the dive brakes. Most aircraft of that era had no way to control speed in a dive. Gravity plus engine power meant you accelerated constantly. By the time you reached bombing altitude, you were going so fast that aiming was impossible. You'd flash past your target in a fraction of a second. Even if you released your bomb perfectly, the aircraft's momentum would carry it hundreds of yards past the target. Pullman solved this with perforated plates under each wing. When deployed, they created massive drag, acting like air brakes on a car. The Stuka could dive at 80 to 90 degrees, almost straight down, while maintaining a constant speed between 310 and 370 miles per hour. Constant speed meant predictable bomb trajectory. Predictable trajectory meant accuracy. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from. Today, the first flight tests in 1935 proved the concept. But proving the concept and perfecting the technique were two entirely different things. This is where the story gets interesting, because the pilot who would eventually perfect the Stuka's capability to hit targets within 30 feet wasn't a natural. He was, by his own admission, terrible at it. His name was Hans-Ulrich Rudel. Rudel was born in July of 1916 in Konradswaldau, a small town in Silesia. His father was a Lutheran minister. Rudel grew up disciplined, athletic, fanatically focused on physical fitness. He didn't drink, didn't smoke, trained obsessively. By his late teens, he was a champion decathlete with legitimate Olympic potential. When he joined the Luftwaffe in December of 1936, Rudel had one goal: become a fighter pilot. Fast aircraft, dogfights, glory. The Luftwaffe had other plans. During basic training, Rudel's instructors noted his excellent physical condition, his absolute refusal to quit under any circumstance. But they also noted something else. He couldn't dive bomb to save his life. Dive bombing required a specific kind of precision. You had to judge altitude by eye. You had to account for wind, aircraft speed, bomb ballistics, and target movement. You had to make split-second decisions while pulling multiple Gs, while the blood drained from your brain, while your vision tunneled and everything in your body screamed that you were about to die. Rudel failed repeatedly. During training exercises in 1938, his instructors rated him unsuitable for combat flying. He was assigned to aerial reconnaissance instead, observer duties. No combat, no glory, just sitting in the back seat taking photographs. Rudel was devastated, but he didn't quit. When Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939, Rudel flew reconnaissance missions. He watched Stuka units from a distance, saw them diving on Polish positions, saw the devastation they caused, and he kept requesting transfer to dive bomber squadrons. His commanding officers kept saying, "No, you're not qualified. You failed the training. Stay in reconnaissance." Rudel kept asking. For 8 months, he submitted formal requests every single week. Finally, in May of 1940, worn down by Rudel's persistence, the Luftwaffe sent him back to dive bomber school. This time, Rudel approached it differently. He'd spent 8 months watching Stuka attacks. He'd seen what worked and what didn't. He'd analyzed the technique from every angle. Now he just had to execute. The problem was the dive itself. Most pilots would roll inverted at altitude, pull back on the stick, and let gravity do the work. The aircraft would accelerate constantly. By the time they reached bomb release altitude, around 4,500 feet, they'd be going too fast to aim properly. Rudel realized the key was the dive brakes. Not just deploying them, but deploying them at exactly the right moment. Too early, and you'd slow down too much, giving anti-aircraft gunners more time to track you. Too late, and you'd be going too fast to aim. The sweet spot was deploying them immediately after rolling inverted. The dive brakes would bite into the air, creating massive drag. The aircraft would settle into a controlled descent at a constant 350 miles per hour, steady, predictable. But even at constant speed, Rudel discovered another problem. At 80 degrees, you're essentially falling straight down. The target appears to rush upward at you. Your brain, trained by millions of years of evolution to avoid falling to your death, floods your system with panic hormones. Your hands shake, your vision narrows, every instinct screams, "Pull up now." Rudel developed a technique to counter this. He would focus on a reference point on the Stuka's canopy, a small mark etched into the glass. By keeping that mark aligned with the target, he could maintain the perfect dive angle without consciously thinking about it. His brain could focus on one simple task: keep the mark on the target. At 4,800 feet, a contact altimeter would flash a light. This was the 4-second warning. In 4 seconds, at current speed and trajectory, the Stuka would reach bomb release altitude. Rudel would watch the target through that etched mark, steady, breathing, ignoring the ground rushing up at 350 miles per hour. At 4,500 feet, a horn would sound. Release. Now. Rudel would press the bomb release. The 1,000-pound bomb would swing out on its cradle mechanism, clearing the propeller. Simultaneously, the automatic pull-up system would activate, hauling the Stuka's nose up with hydraulic force stronger than any human pilot could generate. The G-forces were enormous. 6, 7, sometimes 8 Gs. Blood drained from Rudel's brain, his vision would grey out. Sometimes he'd black out entirely for a second or two. But the automatic system would level the aircraft at around 1,500 feet, and when Rudel's vision returned, he'd be flying level, target behind him, climbing for altitude. The system worked. But in 1940, Rudel's accuracy was merely average. He could hit a 50-yard circle consistently. That was better than conventional bombers, but nothing exceptional. What Rudel wanted was to hit a 10-yard circle, 30 feet. The problem was that nobody thought it was possible. The ballistics alone made it nearly impossible. A 1,000-pound bomb dropped from 4,500 feet doesn't fall straight down. It carries forward momentum from the aircraft. Wind affects it, air density affects it, even temperature affects the fuse timing. Rudel became obsessed. During training flights, he would attack the same practice target repeatedly, noting where each bomb landed. Too far left. Adjust. Too far right. Adjust. He filled notebooks with calculations. Dive angle. Release altitude. Aircraft. Speed. Wind direction. Temperature. Barometric pressure. Other pilots thought he was crazy. Why obsess over a few yards? Bombs were big. Targets were big. Close enough was good enough. But Rudel understood something they didn't. In real combat, targets wouldn't be large formations. They'd be individual tanks, individual artillery pieces, individual bunkers. A bomb that landed 30 yards from a tank did nothing. A bomb that landed 30 feet from a tank destroyed it completely. The breakthrough came during a training exercise in June of 1941, just before Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Rudel was attacking a practice target, a wooden mock-up of a Soviet tank. He rolled inverted, deployed dive brakes, aligned his reference mark, watched the contact altimeter flash, listened for the horn. But this time, at the last possible instant, he made a tiny adjustment, a fraction of a degree, a split-second delay on the release. The practice bomb hit 6 feet from the target. Rudel circled around. He tried again. Same adjustment. The bomb hit 4 feet away. Again, 2 feet. On the 4th attempt, the bomb landed directly on the wooden mock-up, obliterating it. Rudel had found it, the exact combination of dive angle, speed, and release timing that would put a bomb exactly where he wanted it. The technique required absolute precision, no room for error. But it worked. He practiced for 3 more weeks. By the time Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, Rudel could consistently place bombs within a 30-foot radius. He'd gone from unsuitable for combat to the most accurate dive bomber pilot in the Luftwaffe. But knowing how to do something in training and proving it in combat were entirely different things. Rudel's first combat mission came on June 23, 1941. The target was a Soviet supply depot near the border. He rolled his Stuka inverted at 13,000 feet, deployed the dive brakes, and began the descent. Everything he'd practiced, every calculation, every tiny adjustment, it all came together. The bomb hit within 20 feet of the depot's main building. The building collapsed. Secondary explosions ripped through stored ammunition. Rudel pulled up, circled, and watched Soviet soldiers scatter like ants from a destroyed hill. His rear gunner, Erwin Henschel, was shouting through the intercom, "Direct hit! Direct hit!" Rudel said nothing. He was already scanning for the next target. Over the next 2 months, Rudel flew missions almost daily. Bridges, artillery positions, supply columns. Every mission, he refined his technique further. He discovered that slight variations in altitude affected accuracy more than wind. He learned to account for the Stuka's weight distribution as fuel burned off. He developed an instinctive feel for when to release, a split-second sense of timing that couldn't be taught, only learned through repetition. By September of 1941, Rudel had flown nearly 200 missions. His accuracy had become legendary within his squadron. Other pilots would watch him attack targets and shake their heads. "How does he do it?" they'd ask. Rudel's answer was always the same: practice. And the dive brakes. The dive brakes were the key to everything. They transformed the Stuka from a decent dive bomber into a precision instrument. At constant speed, the bomb's trajectory became predictable. Rudel had calculated the exact drop pattern for every combination of altitude, speed, and dive angle. He'd memorized dozens of bombing tables. When he looked at a target, his brain automatically computed the solution. But it was in September of 1941 that Rudel would achieve what many consider the most remarkable single-pilot strike of the entire war. The target was the Soviet battleship Marat, anchored in Kronstadt harbour near Leningrad. The Marat was a 23,000-ton behemoth, a Gangut-class battleship with 12-inch armour plating and enough firepower to devastate German positions for miles around. Soviet naval artillery from the Marat had been pounding German forces advancing on Leningrad. The ship had to be neutralized. The Luftwaffe had tried conventional bombing, high-altitude raids, multiple attacks. Nothing worked. Bombs would land in the water around the ship, some close enough to spray the decks with shrapnel, but the Marat's armour was too thick. Near misses did nothing. Rudel volunteered for a specialized attack. He would dive-bomb the Marat directly, not with a conventional bomb, with a specially modified 2,000-pound armour-piercing bomb designed to punch through ship armour. His squadron commander told him he was insane. The Marat had dozens of anti-aircraft guns. The ship would see him coming from miles away. They'd track him through the entire dive. At the shallow angle required for accuracy, he'd be exposed to enemy fire for at least 30 seconds. Rudel's response was simple. "Then I'll have to not miss." On September 23, 1941, at 06:45 hours, Rudel took off from his airfield near Leningrad. He climbed to 16,000 feet, positioning himself with the sun at his back. The Marat sat in the harbour below, massive and grey, surrounded by smaller escort vessels. Rudel rolled inverted. He deployed the dive brakes. The Stuka settled into its characteristic screaming dive, the wind-powered sirens on the landing gear shrieking their infamous wail. Every gun on the Marat opened fire. 88mm flak shells burst around him. Smaller caliber rounds traced past his cockpit. The Soviet gunners were good. They were tracking him perfectly. Rudel focused on his reference mark. The mark, the target. Nothing else existed. He ignored the flak, ignored the tracers, ignored the fact that a single hit would blow him out of the sky. At 4,800 feet, the contact altimeter flashed. At 4,500 feet, the horn sounded. Rudel released. The 2,000-pound bomb swung clear of the propeller. The automatic pull-up system activated. Rudel pulled 7.5 Gs, his vision greying out as blood drained from his brain. The Stuka leveled at 1,200 feet. Rudel blinked, forcing his vision to clear, and looked back. The bomb hit the Marat's forward deck, between the first and second turret. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then, the armor-piercing warhead detonated inside the ship. The explosion was catastrophic. The forward magazine cooked off. The entire bow of the Marat erupted in a column of fire and smoke that rose 300 feet into the air. The blast wave flipped smaller boats in the harbour. Windows shattered in buildings 2 miles away. When the smoke cleared, the Marat's bow was gone. Just gone. The forward third of the ship had been obliterated. 326 Soviet sailors were dead. The ship settled onto the Taints, harbour bottom in shallow water, listing heavily to port, completely out of action. 1 bomb, 1 pilot. One of the most successful single aircraft strikes in naval history. Rudel returned to base. His commanding officer was waiting on the runway. "Did you hit it?" the commander asked. Rudel pointed to the column of black smoke visible on the horizon, miles away. "I think so," he said. But the Marat was just the beginning. Rudel would go on to fly over 2,500 combat missions, more than any other pilot in history. And it was during the massive tank battles on the Eastern Front that his precision bombing technique would prove most valuable. In 1943, the Stuka's role evolved. The Ju-87G variant was introduced, equipped with 2 37mm cannons under the wings for anti-tank work. Rudel helped develop the tactics for this configuration. The cannons were devastating against Soviet armor, but they required even more precision than bombs. A tank is a small target, maybe 20 feet long, 10 feet wide. From the air, it looks like a toy. To hit one with cannon fire while diving at 300 miles per hour required adjustments in fractions of degrees. Miss by a few feet, and you've wasted ammunition. Hit perfectly, and you could punch a hole straight through the thinnest part of the tank's armor. Rudel adapted his dive bombing technique for strafing runs. He would dive at 60 degrees instead of 80, giving him more time to aim the cannons. He'd deploy the dive brakes to maintain constant speed, exactly as he'd done with bombing. At 800 yards, he'd open fire. Short bursts, 3 to 5 rounds, tungsten carbide armor-piercing rounds that could penetrate 4 inches of steel. The technique worked. Spectacularly. On July 5, 1943, the first day of the Battle of Kursk, Rudel destroyed 12 Soviet T-34 tanks in a single day. 12. Think about that. 1 pilot, 1 aircraft, 12 tanks. Each tank represented a crew of 4 or 5 men, 30 tons of armor and weaponry, months of factory production. Rudel eliminated an entire tank company in 8 hours. His method was surgical. He would identify a target, usually from behind where the armor was thinnest, near the engine compartment. He'd roll into a 60-degree dive, deploy dive brakes, line up the shot. At 600 yards, he'd fire a 3-round burst. If the first burst missed, he'd adjust and fire again. He rarely needed a 3rd burst. Soviet tankers began to recognize the sound of his Stuka, the particular pitch of the dive, the timing of the cannon fire. When they heard it, they'd bail out immediately, abandoning perfectly functional tanks because they knew Rudel was coming. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But the precision that made Rudel so effective also made him a massive target. Soviet commanders put a 100,000 ruble bounty on his head. Stalin himself reportedly knew Rudel's name and wanted him dead. Rudel was shot down 30 times. 30. He survived each time. Sometimes he crashed behind enemy lines and had to walk back to German territory. Sometimes he bailed out over friendly forces. Sometimes he nursed a damaged Stuka back to base with one engine smoking and half the tail shot away. The injuries accumulated. Shrapnel wounds, bullet wounds, broken bones. In March of 1944, he landed behind Soviet lines to rescue a downed crew member. The ground was too soft to take off again. Rudel and 3 other pilots had to walk 50 miles through Soviet-occupied territory to reach German lines. His rear gunner drowned trying to swim the Dniester River. Rudel made it across and kept walking. By February of 1945, Rudel had been wounded 5 times and was flying missions with barely healed injuries. On February 8th, he attacked a column of Soviet tanks near Frankfurt an der Oder. He destroyed 13 tanks that day. It would be his last perfect mission. On February 9th, during his second sortie of the day, Soviet anti-aircraft fire hit his Stuka. A 37mm shell tore through the cockpit, shattering Rudel's right foot. He managed to land the aircraft, barely conscious from blood loss. Doctors amputated his right leg below the knee. Most pilots would have been grounded permanently. Rudel was back in the cockpit 6 weeks later, flying with a prosthetic leg. He flew over 30 more combat missions before the war ended. The precision he'd developed with the dive brakes, the technique that allowed him to hit targets within 30 feet, never left him. Even with one leg, even in pain, Rudel's accuracy remained extraordinary. But Rudel's story, while remarkable, is inseparable from the larger story of the Stuka and its impact on warfare. The dive brake innovation that Rudel mastered so completely changed how air forces thought about ground attack. Before the Stuka, tactical bombing meant flying over a target at altitude and hoping bombs landed somewhere useful. The Stuka proved that aircraft could serve as flying artillery, delivering precise strikes on specific targets. That doctrine, that combination of steep diving and speed control through dive brakes, influenced aircraft design for decades. The American A-10 Warthog, developed in the 1970s, uses similar principles: slower speed for better targeting, heavy armament for specific point targets, the ability to operate close to friendly forces because of pinpoint accuracy. The Stuka's dive brake system, that simple innovation of perforated plates creating drag, made all of it possible. Without dive brakes, pilots couldn't control their speed. Without controlled speed, they couldn't aim accurately. Without accurate aim, dive bombing was just conventional bombing with extra risk. The statistics tell the story. In Poland, France, and the early Eastern Front campaigns, Stukas operating in 80-degree dives with full dive brake deployment achieved hit rates of 75%. 75%. Compare that to the 3% hit rate of conventional horizontal bombers. That 25-fold improvement in accuracy meant fewer aircraft needed, fewer missions flown, fewer pilots lost. It meant a single Stuka could accomplish what would have required 20 conventional bombers. The force multiplication was enormous, but the Stuka also revealed the limits of precision. The aircraft's success depended entirely on air superiority. When German fighters controlled the sky, Stukas were devastating. When they didn't, Stukas were sitting ducks. During the Battle of Britain in 1940, RAF Spitfires and Hurricanes shot down Stukas in droves. The Luftwaffe lost so many that they withdrew Stuka units from the battle entirely. The problem was the dive itself. To achieve the accuracy that made Stukas effective, pilots had to commit to a nearly vertical dive. For 30 to 40 seconds, they flew a completely predictable path. Any competent fighter pilot could line up a shot, and the Stuka's top speed of 232 miles per hour meant it couldn't outrun anything. By 1943, most Stuka units had been withdrawn from areas where Allied fighters operated. They continued to be effective on the Eastern Front, where Soviet air defenses were less organized, but in Western Europe and the Mediterranean, they'd become obsolete. Still, the legacy remained. Over 4,800 Stukas were built during the war. They sank more Allied ships than any other Axis aircraft. They destroyed thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and fortified positions, and they terrified a generation of soldiers with the distinctive scream of their sirens and the knowledge that when a Stuka dove, something was about to be obliterated. The sound alone was psychological, warfare. The wind-powered sirens mounted on the landing gear, nicknamed Trumpets of Jericho, created a howling wail that could be heard for miles. Ernst Udet had personally ordered them installed. The sirens served no tactical purpose, they just made noise, but that noise was unforgettable. French soldiers in 1940 reported that the sound of diving Stukas caused panic even among experienced troops. Some units refused to leave their bunkers when they heard the sirens, even when they weren't the target. The psychological impact was as important as the physical destruction, but sound and fear couldn't substitute for tactical advantage. By 1945, only 100 Stukas remained operational out of the nearly 5,000 built. The rest had been shot down, destroyed on the ground, or scrapped for parts. The age of the dive bomber was over. Modern guided munitions, developed after the war, made the entire concept obsolete. Why risk a pilot's life diving into anti-aircraft fire when you could drop a bomb from 20,000 feet and guide it to the target with laser designation, or GPS? The precision that required Rudel's years of practice and extraordinary skill could now be achieved by any pilot with the right equipment. But in the moment, in the early days of World War II, that precision was revolutionary, and it all came down to those dive brakes, those simple perforated plates that gave pilots control over their descent speed. Hermann Pohlmann, the Stuka's designer, believed that dive bombers should be simple and robust. He was right. The Stuka's fixed landing gear was obsolete by 1935 standards. The inverted gull wings were structurally inefficient. The aircraft was slow, ungainly, and ugly, but it was also nearly indestructible. Stukas operated from muddy fields, bomb-cratered runways, and improvised strips that would have grounded more sophisticated aircraft. That ruggedness, combined with the accuracy enabled by Kumstum-Rafe dive brakes, made the Stuka effective far longer than its specifications suggested it should be. Rudel himself never claimed to have invented anything. He repeatedly said the dive brakes did the work. All he did was learn to use them perfectly. That humility masked the reality that very few pilots ever achieved his level of mastery. The technique required thousands of repetitions. It required an obsessive attention to detail. It required the ability to remain calm while falling toward the earth at 350 miles per hour with enemy fire all around you. Most pilots were content with hitting a target within 50 yards. That was considered excellent accuracy. Rudel demanded 30 feet. And through sheer repetition, through endless practice, through an unwillingness to accept anything less than perfection, he achieved it. The cost of that perfection was high. Rudel survived the war, but many Stuka pilots didn't. The casualty rate among dive bomber crews was brutal. Flying, slow, predictable aircraft into concentrated anti-aircraft fire had a mathematical inevitability. Eventually, the statistics caught up with you. Of the pilots who flew Stukas in Poland in September 1939, fewer than 20% survived the entire war. The odds were worse for rear gunners, who sat exposed in the back seat with minimal protection. Many crews flew together for months, developing the timing and communication required for effective operations, only to be shot down on what seemed like a routine mission. But the pilots who survived became extraordinarily skilled. The learning curve was steep because mistakes were fatal. Either you learned to dive bomb accurately while avoiding enemy fire, or you died. There was no middle ground. The survivors, pilots like Rudel, represented the absolute peak of their profession. When the war ended in May of 1945, Rudel surrendered to American forces. He'd been flying until the last days, leading missions, even with his prosthetic leg. His final tally was staggering. Over 2,500 combat missions, 519 tanks destroyed, 1 battleship, 1 cruiser, 1 destroyer, 70 landing craft, over 800 vehicles, 150 artillery positions, and 9 aircraft shot down in aerial combat. No other pilot in history came close to those numbers, not because other pilots weren't skilled or brave, but because no other pilot had Rudel's combination of precision technique, obsessive practice, and extraordinary luck. Rudel's post-war life was controversial. He remained an unrepentant Nazi, emigrated to Argentina, and worked as an arms dealer. His political views were reprehensible, but the tactical innovations he represented, the perfection of dive bombing technique, remained significant. In the 1970s, when American designers were developing the A-10 Warthog ground attack aircraft, they consulted Rudel. His insights on low-altitude precision attack informed the A-10's design philosophy. The idea that slower speed could mean better accuracy, that getting close to the target was more effective than standoff weapons, that specialized aircraft could outperform generalists in specific roles. All of that came from lessons learned with the Stuka. Today, no flyable Stukas remain. A few exist in museums, preserved as historical artifacts. The Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago has one, displayed in a permanent dive position, as if frozen in the moment before releasing its bomb. The Technik Museum Sinsheim in Germany has another, recovered from the Mediterranean Sea where it crashed in 1943. These aircraft, preserved behind glass, can't convey what it was like to fly one. The sound of the sirens, the feel of the dive brakes deploying, the gut-wrenching pull-out as the automatic system hauled the nose up, the satisfaction of seeing your bomb hit exactly where you aimed it. That experience died with the pilots, who flew them. Rudel was one of the last, dying in 1982 at age 66. With him went the living memory of what it took to master the Stuka's dive brake system to achieve that 30-foot accuracy, to become the kind of pilot who could hit a specific tank in a column of 20 while diving at 350 miles per hour through anti-aircraft fire. The technique itself wasn't magic. It was physics and practice. The dive brakes created constant speed. Constant speed created predictable trajectories. Predictable trajectories allowed precise aiming, and precise aiming, repeated thousands of times with obsessive attention to detail, created the most accurate bombing system of the early war. But knowing how it worked and being able to do it were entirely different things. Thousands of pilots flew Stukas. Only a handful achieved Rudel's level of accuracy. The difference wasn't intelligence or physical ability. It was patience, the willingness to practice the same, dive 1,000 times, making tiny adjustments, recording every result, building an instinctive understanding of exactly how the aircraft and bomb would behave in any given situation. That kind of mastery can't be taught from a manual. It can only be earned through repetition. And in warfare, where repetition means risking your life again and again, very few people achieve it. The Stuka proved that precision matters more than numbers, that one accurate bomb is worth 20 near misses, that an aircraft doesn't need to be fast or sophisticated if it can reliably hit what it aims at, and that simple innovations, like perforated plates acting as dive brakes, can change the fundamental nature of aerial warfare. The legacy of those dive brakes lives on in every precision-guided munition, every smart bomb, every drone strike that hits a target within meters of the aim point. The technology has changed. The principle hasn't. Accuracy multiplies force. Precision reduces collateral damage. The ability to hit exactly what you're aiming at is worth more than the ability to drop 1,000 bombs randomly. Rudel understood this in 1941. So did Hermann Pohlmann when he designed those dive brakes in 1935. And so did Ernst Udet when he watched American pilots dive bombing in Cleveland in 1931 and realized he was seeing the future of tactical aviation. The Stuka was crude, ugly, slow, obsolete before the war was half over. But for a brief window in history, it was the most accurate bomber in the world. And that accuracy, made possible by dive brakes and perfected by pilots like Rudel, changed how wars were fought. The farmhouses in France, where German troops sheltered, the tanks on the Eastern Front that Soviet crews abandoned when they heard that particular scream, the ships in harbours that couldn't maneuver fast enough to avoid a bomb falling straight down, all of them learned what it meant to face an aircraft that could put ordnance within 30 feet of any target. That was the revolution. Not the aircraft itself, but what it could do. And what it could do was only possible because of one simple innovation: dive brakes that let pilots control their speed during the most dangerous 30 seconds of their lives. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.